And I think, one of the things we both face, as we were talking about just now, is the challenge sometimes of reaching across lines of race and class, experience, wealth, disability, sexual orientation, gender. You deal with all of that stuff in a pretty heavy-duty way in your work in Oakland. But as we're sitting here in this beautiful outdoor setting in Bayview, Michigan, one of our challenges, I think, in the white church is sometimes we have folks who are very well-meaning and well-intentioned, but how do we develop empathy? Not just sympathy, not just top-down, I'll contribute my money, I'll make the casserole for the homeless shelter, but actually an understanding across those lines among different people. I know that's been a challenge to a certain extent when you do speak at a relatively homogeneous, mostly older group like this. How do we manage to bridge that gap to have genuine understanding?
Well, first of all, I think there are a number of things that all humankind have in common. I think that all people are subject to some of the same struggles and realities, family, interactions with their children, interactions with society. I think that even among the most wealthy folks, there is still often a presence of patriarchy, a diminishment of women, of people who come from certain race backgrounds. I would say that among Europeans, there is the idea of folks who are highbrow European descent and others that are of lowbrow European descent. You
were referring earlier to the fact that the Irish
Precisely.
were kind of the folks that were on the trash heap of,
Precisely.
and then juxtaposing it with gay people today. Yeah.
Precisely. And so there's wherever there is the notion of high is only high in relationship to something else being low. So, but even among people that seem to be all a part of the high, there's an idea of low among those folks. And when I'm on the continent of Africa, where everybody is my color or darker, there is the idea that some tribes are more powerful than other tribes. I was among the Ashanti. I spent some time with the traditional king, Otumfuo. And one of his folks that worked for him took me to the side and said, well, we have never been slaves. That's the way he said it to me. We have never been slaves. My people have never been slaves. It frustrated me. And he kept saying it until I finally said to him, I said, well, I'm the progeny of slaves.
Yeah.
And apparently, inasmuch as we survived the crossing, and we survived slavery, and we survived the lynchings and the burnings, I must be made of stock that may be stronger than the stock you're made of. That was what it took to make him leave me alone.
Oh, wow.
The heart of it was, here I am talking to a black man in black Africa who is suggesting that he is from a lineage that is higher than my lineage because he was not, or his ancestors were not made slaves. So I think that this reality exists in humankind everywhere. It is not unique to conversations of black and white and brown, or men and women, or straight and gay, or even the hierarchy of gay. I have worked with gay men who will not work with trans people. I have worked with lesbian women who will not work with men under any circumstances. I cannot even begin to say how much I see this happen. My heart says, however, that there is something in the human experience that needs to change this dynamic so we can find our way to one another without having to be hierarchical to do that.
I want to transition to a positive example, but I know that you do work with the Human Rights Campaign. I remember the Triangle Ball. I'd worked on the Clinton Gore campaign. My friend Tammy Baldwin, who's now a U.S. Senator, the two of us had gone to Washington for this event. Of the 500 people in that room, there were 5 women. It was Tammy, Melissa Etheridge, Katie Lang, and 2 other women. And most were very, very wealthy, white privileged men. And of course, that's the way much of our movement was run in the past, before we had an awareness of class awareness, different types of diversity, began to bring the T into the LGB. So it's a journey. One hopes that we're advancing further along on it.
And even among people who are most marginalized, there tends to be this idea about othering. And I've watched it happen. When I've worked with the Human Rights Campaign during the times or during the season when we were really working for marriage equality in hard places among black churches in the suburbs of Maryland, D.C., and I remember very distinctly the work that it took to go out there and work with those churches. And MacArthur Flournoy was there, and Candy Holmes and others that worked with him, and worked with those black churches, and the Dillman coats that came to the front as a result of that. And I remember being in meetings where I said to them, and we said to them, thank God for those of us that stand in the gap, but as it relates to color and sexuality. And I remember some of the leadership feeling that that wasn't really such a great contribution, essentially. I remember asking them, so exactly how were you going to move black preachers if you hadn't had us? It was so hard for someone to say in that moment that it takes people of faith, LGBT people of faith, to work with people of faith, right? Because there was a pallor, a patina that was on a predominantly LGBT organization that did not want to talk a lot about the power of faith and people of faith who are gay and lesbian, transgender, and such like.
A good friend of mine, Harry Knox, used to do the faith program, interfaith program. He's a good guy. But yeah, this is a conundrum a lot of us would face. In Madison, we have a coalition that was called Coming Out, Coming Together. Now, unfortunately, someone got the idea that, oh, well, we've already solved our problems. We don't need it anymore. We're a little more complicated than that. But I hope we bring that coalition together again, because that's such a central dilemma. And some folks are so injured, have been so injured by the church that they'll never come back. But there are others of us who've been in exile that want to return, because especially in communities like, if you're gay and black, the church is your community. It is your source of support, and to have lost that is an unfathomable loss.
And there's some things that are just not going to move if we don't. Folk don't want to run the church gamut, the religion gamut, doing this work. When we were doing Proposition 8 in the first time around in California, talking about marriage equality, we talked a lot about the importance of having people of faith who are LGBT and LGBT affirming involved. And the organizers said, well, we don't want that. And when they didn't really make an impact for marriage equality in the black community, we came back around and said, we told you. There are people of faith who are African American and people of color and people, period, who would be more than glad to address this from a theological standpoint. Because faith has to talk to faith. And the idea that that's impossible and missing that opportunity, I believe, really hurt us at the polls the first time around. And I continue to say it. We need to meet faith with faith. I am a person of faith. I am an LGBT person. I am a lesbian who has been married to my partner for 34 years. And I have a complete affirmation in my spirit that what I am called to and who I am and who I love is in God's perfect and intentional will for my life. I have an opportunity then to stand in a gap as it relates to faith. And that's why opportunities like what I'm having here with my Bay folks here, right? It blesses me because as one of my children said one day, I ain't scared. I'm not, because I know these people by spirit, not by race, not by economic strata, but what I do feel is that the same Spirit of God that dwells in them is the Spirit of God that dwells in me.
I want to come back to a little bit to how faith has played out in the Madison LGBT struggle. But just one observation as you're talking about the folks here, a more familiar, warmer recollection, of sitting in a room like we sat in this morning, is it's like a PFLAG meeting. Because those folks come from a diversity of backgrounds, but many of them are quite affluent. Many of them have never had to grapple in their lives before with the notion of oppression. But now that it's hitting someone they love, that's transformed not only their relationship with their loved one and their relationship with the world, it's transformed their faith.
Yes.
Because they've opened their hearts to a different way. There are a couple of examples. There's a man now traveling the South who lost his daughter to suicide 25 years ago and realized he contributed to what happened, but now his life's journey is to make that better in her honor. There's a book called Prayers for Bobby. It was made into a TV movie with Sigourney Weaver. Mary, the mother of a child who leapt off an overpass in Portland back when he was 18, has made her life's work, changing all of that. They were people who had been very dogmatic in their beliefs, very unquestioning, but now they've opened their minds and their hearts, and that kind of transformation is happening in a lot of places.
And I am absolutely deeply moved when I hear people shift and change.
Yeah.
That it comes through the experience of tragedy. I'm also very conscious of the fact that we need people to shift and change without tragedy. Essentially, my story has times, echoes, experiences of difficulty and tragedy. But that's not my story in the truest sense of the word. My story suggests that my affirmation was not in spite of my relationship to God, it was because of my relationship to God. And I want to see more people become affirming, not because they pity us, not because the church has broken us, but I want them to understand that we've learned more about God from our struggle, that we've become more self-affirming because of our struggle. I am the end product, essentially, of what I've been through, but how I used it more for my growth than for my, for an affirmation of, I'm not going to give the church that much power. I don't know another way to say it, brother.
Sure.
I thank God, I praise God, but there was a turning point. If you just let me say, a turning point. My turning point was that I decided one of two things is going to happen. Either everybody is a hateful hypocrite and I'm not going to have anything to do with them for the rest of my life.
Right.
Or the other direction is I realized I expected more out of human beings than human beings tend to offer. And I have decided that I am not going to use this as a stumbling block, but rather as a stepping stone for my own confidence, because confidence is contagious. And that is the foundation stone of the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries.
Absolutely.
We are who we are because we are affirming first ourselves and then affirming those that we come in contact.
There's so many directions to go, but in one of my favorite interviews is with an author named Deborah Stone, wrote a book called Samaritan's Dilemma, Should Our Government Help Our Neighbors? And 2/3 of the book is about the nature of altruism. And her thesis is that people are inherently altruistic. But it's coming back to your notion, you shouldn't do this just because something bad happened to you.
That's right.
You had a struggle with cancer, so now you want to help other folks with cancer.
Right.
Or you have a gay or lesbian kid and you want to help other people with that. I mean, that's not an important part of the motivation, but empathy and compassion and love, in the case of the Christian traditions, Christ-like understanding of other people outside of your own experience really has to come from deep within. And that, of course, it's not just the Christian experience, it's the golden rule that winds its way through almost every faith tradition.
Right. Because it's right.
Exactly.
Because it's just right.
Yeah.
It is right for me to treat you right. It is correct for me to treat you with kindness and with empathy, and for me to choose to believe the best of you and not the worst of you.
Yeah.
It is right for me to do that. And if all of this God talk and God experience and singing all these hymns and listening to all this preaching and having all these baptisms and Eucharists and carrying on does not lift up for us and enable us to be what we consider Christ-like, then what is the point? We may as well be somewhere eating chicken sandwiches and drinking red Kool-Aid, okay? What is the point of us doing this?
It's a story that's told by Congressman Lewis from, of course, he was beaten, John Lewis, during the Mississippi riots. He was there on the Selma Bridge. And I guess a guy showed up at his office a few years ago who had been one of the men who'd beaten him.
Yes.
The guy didn't know what to expect. He had, he just said, you have every right to berate me and to call me and make me accountable for this horrible thing that not only tarnished your life at the time, but mine. Instead, they got down on their knees and they prayed together.
That's the way to do it.
And he ends the story just with this simple admonition: people can change.
Yes, they can. And love can change people.
Yeah.
And the love of God, the presence of God, the heart of God, what is all of this God talk for?
Yeah.
If it cannot definitively shift and change people. And I know there are a black lesbian woman. I know a lot of black lesbian women who would break out in a rash to be in a room full of older white Methodists, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
I frankly believe that the internal work, let me make an I statement, that I have had to do to try to see with the eyes of Christ, doesn't open me up to be so much a perfect woman, but it opens me up, I believe, to be a powerful woman who can be an agent for change. I can't change folks who won't, and work with change with folks who won't talk to me.
Yeah.
If I'm cussing you out in the first conversation, that's going to make it really hard for us to have the second conversation.
I've been blessed by so many African American women who have developed a level of trust in me to tell me that kind of inside story. Yes. I took 2 courses on the history of women and the black civil rights movement, both white and black women.
Yes.
But my best experience is with a woman named Joanne Bland down in Selma. And she was 11 at the time of the Selma to Montgomery March.
Yes.
And she'd already been arrested 13 times for civil disobedience. But she founded, about 25 years later, the National Voting Rights Museum, this great grassroots institution. And now she comes to other places, especially Wisconsin, to tell young people about all of this. But one of the things she told me in an interview we did with Parker Palmer a few years ago, who's also an amazing guy, about talking about breaking open the hearts and other things, was for 20 to 25 years after the Selma experience, she didn't have any friends with white people. She had been burnt and hurt and injured and disrespected in such profound ways she couldn't do that. And yet the Selma experience in part was about white and black people coming together.
Brother.
But it takes a while when you're wounded to trust again.
It does. And there's a part that has to be healed.
Yeah.
And I had my birth father was a physically abusive person. He was a survivor of the Korean conflict.
Yeah.
And there were things that happened. This church boy went to Korea, and he was green. When he came home, he was different. And I suspect diagnosably dealing with PTSD.
Yeah.
And every so often, he would just be super violent. And I was young, and my mother worked, and my dad worked at night, so he was there in the daytime when I came home. And so there were times when he would rage, and when he would rage, he would sometimes come for me, right? And so I'd been in the hospital before over some of those realities. And I remember late in life that my dad was in need. He was displaced, and I hadn't seen him for years. And he came back and looked for me. And he also had a baby son with him, whose mother had left. And I remember initially trying to be very saintly. Forgive him, let him go, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I let him stay with me for a time. And I kept the child in the whole 9 yards. And then one day, it hit me. Everything that I needed to say to my father.
Yeah.
About what I felt about my father. And with the help from a couple glasses of wine, I realized that I started on one side of my father and came back over the top of his head and down the other side verbally about everything that I was feeling. And then I broke and cried like a baby.
Yeah.
When my father died, he was a member of my church. In fact, I had made him a deacon. And our relationship healed beautifully. What I really do believe is that there is a necessity at times for catharsis, to your point. A necessity to really be able to say what pain has been caused to us.
Yeah.
But what should come after that, and soon after, is healing, if we are going to work together and find real reconciliation.
Another favorite interview, a gentleman named Rizzy Tamain. He grew up as...
I know Rizzy.
You know Rizzy? Okay.
Before
Los Angeles?
Rizzy became Rizzy.
Yeah, okay.
Before Rizzy became
all right.
The trans person. That
So the arc of his story is essentially his parents put him through conversion therapy,
That's right.
exercised him, did all these
All
other
of
things in conservative Christian territory in Nigeria.
All of that.
But to cut to the punch, when his father was ill, when his father was in need,
Precisely.
even though his father had done these horrible things to him and rejected him and never understood him, his father had cancer, no one else could help. He went and lived with him in London for a year.
That's right.
And at the end of the year, again, the father got down on his knees and said, "How could I have treated you so poorly?
Yes.
You are a child of God, and I love you, and I will spend the rest of my life undoing the damage that I did to you."
Yes.
Who would have guessed that?
And who would have thought it possible? And in fact, it would not have been possible if he had not received the love that affirmed him all by himself.
Yeah.
Fully affirming yourself in the presence of the living God. And then being able to go out from that with fierce love. And so for the Papa Timani was not able to see and understand. The Papa Timani was simply embarrassed in the community that his daughter has become a man.
Right.
It shamed him in community.
Yeah.
But the reconciliation was born out of the fierceness of Rizzy's love for his father. And how incredibly potent is love.
Yeah.
Who else? Only the love of God can love the hell out of people.
And not in a conventional sense, but Rizzy is a pastor now.
Absolutely.
He is spreading
Still
love
writing
and
books and singing, still making.
And now I know
music.
Tamani, not Tamain.
Timani,
Okay.
yeah. But still making music. It's incredible to me.
Yeah.
Incredible. And you ask Rizzy about some of the conversations that we had.
Well, he was part of my inspiration. About 8 years ago, we founded an international group. I work with a group called the United Nations Association that works on LGBT rights. And it's just, in Uganda, Pepe Nzima, anyway, I'm forgetting one of his names. He was on John Oliver's show, but he is a transgender activist within Uganda who has the ultimate patience.
Yes.
Will listen and be berated by a commentator. Of course, it's Scott Lively and a lot of Americans that created all the trouble in Uganda. But, I mean, John Oliver described him as the Gandhi of our times, for God's sake.
Yes.
And just the theme here, I think, is that the transgender folks are pioneers.
Yes.
They may be 0.4% of the population, whatever, but come back to your salt metaphor of yesterday, they are the salt and the spice of everything.
Yes,
because
God.
they get us to rethink and reframe gender and expectations and everything else, and simply to be who we are.
And in some ways to even be more like God.
Yes. Well, Native American folks, of course, two-spirited folks are held up as...
Oh, man.
Yeah.
And God's own declaration of God's own self is the beautiful merging of male and female.
Yeah.
And at some point we have to understand that God is not binary. God is all of that at the same time. And we should be able to see that in creation that reality exists in so many ways. And so, yes, they are the powerful, pioneering prophets of our time.
Absolutely.
And so be it.
Yeah.
So be it.
I want to come back to a little bit of what I've told you in Madison. Again, first just to say that the history of the churches, I wish this coalition will form. I'm going to be a catalyst to hopefully getting it to form again, because the faith journey has been so intertwined and important. We passed one of the first gay rights laws back in 1975. We had the fourth openly gay person in our city council a year before Harvey Milk. We now have had 40 or 50 openly gay and lesbian elected officials. But one of the things we did in 1982 was pass the first in the nation statewide gay rights law.
Yes.
That couldn't have happened without the Catholic Church.
Yes.
And without Archbishop Weekland and other people who said, regardless of how you feel about the biblical or other issues, everyone deserves dignity and respect and non-discrimination. And then dozens of other churches have come through, other coalitions have formed, and held back the backlash. And there's a credibility and a power in a person of faith taking that stand.
Yes.
But it takes courage. It takes salt.
And it takes salt. We got to be salty. And I think it's important to understand how we have done this for years. People have their own hatreds. You go back to what you originally asked me. People have their own hatreds. They have their own fears. They have issues of racism, pejorative assumptions of the other. And then what they do is they go to the text and they try to find something that defends their already existing pejorative assumptions of the other. The assumptions begin first, and then the proof texting in terms of trying to find something that they say God said.
Yeah.
All out of context, all out of time, wrong interpretation. It doesn't matter, just so long as it supports what it is.
And they go to the Old Testament, realizing that the New Testament was a new beginning, and Christ was saying, just be good to each other, essentially.
And you've heard it said of old, an eye for eye, and tooth for tooth. But yet, verily I say unto you, he was evolving. He was pulling away from the what seemed to be the evil literalism of interpretation that he was dealing with during his time.
Right.
And so now we have a task. I think the greatest mistake that the church ever made was putting the cover on the back of the Bible. As though God could not reveal more. Well,
the UCC, we have the expression, God is still speaking.
God is God that's God. God can say whatever God wants to say.
Yeah.
And do whatever God wants to do. And we can't trap God in a book or an edited volume of writings, as I say often, and trap God in a theology that supports our hatred. God will not be stuck.
Yep.
And because God is not stuck, we don't have to be stuck. And we can continue to evolve, and the love of God can continue to grow.
So the journey that's happened in the church, what is hardest for me sometimes is to go back to a United Methodist Church that's struggling with whether to be reconciling or open and affirming in the UCC tradition. And it's not my frustration sometimes with the dogmatic folks on the far right who just are going to say, hey, that's what it says in the Bible, that's all that it is. It's the folks in the middle who stand by and who have gay or lesbian friends or family members or other folks that just are afraid, because that's not really why I go to church. I go here to feel good about myself and to feel comfortable and to have potlucks. And I mean, they're not saying that, but that is the difficulty, that we need to recapture that spirit of the civil rights movement, other places where churches were on the cutting edge. And we've lost that in some ways.
I think that a couple of things are very important. One is that because the United Church of Christ has made its declarations from the Senate floor, doesn't mean that everyone in the United Church of Christ agrees with being open and affirming.
Sure.
Not all of our churches are open.
No, because it's a very decentralized process. It's the individual churches that make the decision.
It's definitely a congregational autonomy church in that way. Connected by covenant. I think that's important. So we are still doing work in the United Church of Christ around this. But the other thing that I want to mention is that what I have discovered, that what really weakens at times our work as people of faith to be really affirming of LGBT people, is what I have come to call a fragile patriarchy. And that fragile patriarchy is sort of based on the fact that the idea is that men who have sex with men who are attracted to men, are feminized by that and weakened by that, emasculated by that, right? And the flip side, which is a totally different conversation, is women who are engaged in relationships with women are masculinized by that reality.
Or the question, where's the man in this? There's supposed to be a man in this.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And who's in charge? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So those are two different realities, but they both fold into the fact that there is still a weak and fragile patriarchy that has to continue over and over again to dominate in some way in order to participate
Yeah.
And if what we are going to have to do as the church is understand how painfully problematic that reality is.
So just one quick observation, just, the reason I said where's the man in this situation, I lived with a lesbian family since 4 months before their child was born. And I became an important part of her life, but I needed to make sure that people understood that it was these two women were all that she needed. Yes. But we had the blessing of extended family, which ironically, in an institution of the gay family or the lesbian family that's attacked, we are embracing traditions of 100 years ago, of the notions that it takes the village, it takes that large extended family. Here's where I just want to go, if we can, insights into this current situation. I think we're just going to have you on the radio and maybe be in dialogue with some of the folks in Madison. As I explained, there is a young group of people of color who are LGBT who have expressed that they cannot march in our Pride March with uniformed police because of the trauma, the resident trauma that they may experience themselves or their brethren experienced across the country, which of course we all understand. The difficulty is that we have worked with for decades within the Madison within the Madison Police Department to effect change. Beginning in 1973, when a gentleman named David Cooper, who now is an Episcopalian priest, brought in women and LGBT people and people of color and changed the culture, not just in the rank and file, but in the leadership of this organization. Because these young people don't know or didn't experience that, they haven't embraced it. They say that's no excuse. The institution is inherent. We need to do away with the police entirely. So I don't mean to disrespect their thesis, but this is a conundrum intergenerationally sometimes, not to understand the path that we took, or to come back to your theme, that sometimes institutions and people who didn't get it, who were harmful to us in horrible ways, they can change.
Yes, and I think that there's one thing that I would suggest, because I've seen this happen with Muslim people that were encouraged to walk in peace parades and marches, and were very concerned because of the anti-Muslim realities that existed in their neighborhoods. And one of the beautiful things that I've seen is when Muslim people were marching for freedom and for rights in support of other folks, that in one case a group of Christians got all around them and encircled them. And stood between them and the police.
A variation on what happened at Matthew Shepard's funeral.
Precisely.
The angels that surrounded, that kept the folks from Topeka from...
And something like that might be a wonderful opportunity to both support them and to stand between them and the police department.
No, that's lovely. No, that's a great idea. So the folks that essentially, now that this has been put in place, actually the LGBT police officers and all the different forces have been very magnanimous to say, okay, we understand. We will back away. We will march in plain clothes, but we want to tell you about the changes that have occurred, why we're police, why we're LGBT. That's not incompatible. So the dialogue will probably continue after Sunday, after our march. But what I guess has been hard for me is that folks have said, you're a white guy. You don't have a voice in this. You may be a white gay man, but we just need to shut up, and people of color need to have a voice. Now, I mean, there is a level of that, and mansplaining and all the other phenomenon where white men, including white gay men, sometimes dominate. But I know that you have a deep appreciation also for the journey of men, gay men, whether they be white or people of color, in San Francisco. And I think also a younger generation doesn't understand the nature of the AIDS crisis, all we came through together, how lesbians, who had no stake in this game for the most part, were least likely to contract AIDS, were there for us. The community was formed, that we transcended all of that. But that was a difficult journey, and the trauma still remains. I explained to you, I was brutalized essentially by a policeman. I'm not a person of color, but once they discovered I was gay, that added a whole dimension to it that played out on Facebook in the community. I'm not saying I understand the daily realities of an African-American man in this society, but I have some empathy, and I do have cards to bring to the table. So how do we stop thinking of each other in boxes? You're again, a hierarchy. I'm the other, but I'm up here, and you're down here, and how do we make decisions collectively as a community in a non-tokenistic, non-politically correct, but highly inclusive way?
And think of all of the ways in which we have talked about boxes since we've sat here.
Yeah.
We have wealthy, white, Christian straight boxes. There's a box. We have man boxes. We have gay man boxes. We have black and people of color boxes. We have lesbian women boxes. And all of those various ways in which we have boxed each other, right?
Yeah.
And the way that we think now pejoratively in different ways of other boxes that we think are just too boxy, while we're in our own boxes, they're talking to those boxes, right? Suggests that there is a universal work to do.
Yeah.
There's an up-close work to do, and there's a universal work to do. And I think that whatever the pejorative assumptions people may have of me, and whatever the pejorative assumptions I may have of them,
Yeah.
that we've got to meet somewhere in the middle and find our way to each other. The way that I have done it in meetings like this is I say to people, and I say again, if I objectify you, if I'm determined not to get close to you and I keep you at a distance from me to make sure that your humanity does not come over here
Yeah.
where I am, I can be an enemy of yours forever. But if I cross that line,
Yeah.
and I push myself to see and sense your humanity, and if you'll meet me halfway, we can find some ways, a beginning point, for us to be connected around the issues that matter to both of us.
One last point about transgender people. 1967, I was 7 years old watching Christine Jorgensen on the Phil Donahue show, one of the first trans people who had come out about her experience. She was booed as she met the stage, but through that hour, she so authentically told her story that she got a standing ovation at the end.
That's exactly right, brother.
And I was 7 years old, and boy, that doesn't sound like me, but there's something about this
Yes.
that strikes me, and her courage.
Yes.
That got me through years until grade school, where I actually started talking about it with my parents.
Yes.
And I'm lucky to have parents I could talk about it in grade school. But I mean, the trans experience was part of it's the last thought on this, in a really deeply spiritual way that I can convey to you.
Yes.
I think the revelation to me of this last year is when someone said, our spirits aren't gendered.
Oh, thank God.
That in the everlasting, these labels, these boxes will mean nothing, because our spiritual beings are unencumbered.
Absolutely. Men are not from Mars, women are not from Venus.
Yeah.
I figure we're all kind of like from Pluto or something like that.
And Pluto's been redeemed recently,
That's what
so
I'm
hey.
saying. So we're something in the middle, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And you can only be fully you. You can only be authentically you. Everything else is just a fake and a phony.
Yeah.
Do you, brother. Do you. You do it beautifully. Do you.
Thank you much for beginnings of conversations. I look forward to. Love you too.
Yeah.
Okay.